Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocates Debate Club. Today, I'm going to give an American's brief understanding of Brexit, just because it's something that, as I talk with people around me, a lot of people in America seem to be interested in, but know very little about, and don't take the time out of their days to go learn. So I thought I would cover just a little bit of what's going on. I'll start with a brief description of the European Union for any in America who might not know what it is. The European Union was founded in 1999, I believe, and is a group of countries in Europe that share the same currency. So where we have the dollar, they have the euro. That much most Americans know. And the European Union was originally basically just that. It was a system of shared currency and trading treaties and agreements that made trading in Europe easier when travel in Europe, easier to a degree between these countries, which sounded like a pretty good idea. To the people who supported it, it sounded like an idea with no downside. It would basically mean a stronger trading ground and stronger currency for the countries who signed up in Europe as they partnered together into a single trading state, so to speak. Now, the fear by people who fought against the forming of the European Union at the time, and there were several fears, but the biggest fear, as I understand it, was that the countries would start to lose their sovereignty, that the European Union would, as it gained power in these countries and gained influence, start reaching into more than just economics and start affecting these companies' policies, which is exactly what we've seen happen over the last 30 years as the European Union now is pushing to become an empire. They want their own army. Nigel Farage, oh god. Now I can't think of the guy's name. Definitely not Nigel Farage, though. But anyway, the European Union has taken steps towards making their own army, which would, in theory, probably outclass the single armies of any of the countries in Europe, giving them the power to enforce their mandate. See, right now the European Union can put out suggestions to the other countries. They're usually followed, but it's kind of an interesting system that isn't as binding, kind of like non-binding resolutions in America, except with more of a social backing to them, so they're much more likely to be followed. The European Union will pass something like Articles 11 and 13, which have to do with internet censorship, and they lay out a series of guidelines for, in that case, how the internet is to be used by countries within the European Union. The countries within the European Union must each then pass their own laws in order to figure out how to follow that mandate. So normally, in America, for instance, the federal government will pass a law, and once it's a federal law, all states must follow that law. They can pass their own interpretations of it, tweaks, take it a little bit farther, but they can't take it back. They have to follow that law. With the European Union, it's kind of like if when the federal government issued a law, every state then, rather than having to follow it, had to interpret it and write their own law about how it would be followed, which kind of happens sometimes in the US, but it's standard policy for the European Union and the countries in it. Well, Britain has always had a rather liberal and independent streak. I mean, the Americans who broke free of Britain did come from Britain, and so I do think that a lot of America's independent streak comes fairly directly from our parent country, from Britain. And Britain had had enough of the slow erosion of sovereignty that the EU has spent the last 30 years on. Now, I think that this is a very, very complex subject, and I'm not 100% sure whether or not the European Union, were it to encompass all of Europe, for instance, would operate more smoothly than the countries if they were to each regain or retain their own sovereignty. I do know that the British people voted to leave the European Union. Now, this has some complexities to it because the European Union has agreements with the people who are in it about leaving that make it very hard to leave. In my understanding, generally very expensive to leave. You basically have to pay the European Union to get out. When I put it that way, it sounds almost like a mob racket. But anyway, Britain would most likely tank their economy in the attempt to try and pay the European Union. So most of the people who voted to leave, and the UKIP party, the UK Independence Party, who have been pushing against the European Union basically since its founding, these people all want, and at one point I think expected, or at least hoped, to leave with no deal. Now, what no deal means is that Britain would leave the European Union and not give in to any of the European Union's demands. They would basically say, nope, we are taking back our sovereignty, we are giving you nothing. Because the European Union doesn't have an army. They don't currently have any way to enforce their racketeering. They're working on it. That's currently one of the big pushes going on in the European Union, is to build the EU army, and it was one of the catalysts to Britain kind of seeing them as imperialists and leaving, because Britain has had their bout with imperialism, and I don't think they want to go back. It's very expensive, you see. But now we're in a position where the people of Britain voted in staggering numbers everywhere but London, all across the country, to leave the EU, but the Parliament in Britain, the equivalent to our Congress and House, essentially, the people in power in government, do not want to leave. They don't want to give the people what they voted for. And so a number of deals have been proposed to, quote-unquote, get Britain out of the EU. The one actually put up by the person who was in charge of handling this process, Theresa May, was essentially a surrender from Britain to the EU. It would give the EU back all the same sovereignties that they had over Britain before the Brexit process, while taking away Britain's incredibly hard to use and almost impotent veto function, but a veto function nonetheless. It really was just kind of a slap in the face to the British people, for anyone who understood what was going on, and for those who had voted to leave in Britain, which were by far the majority, they took it that way. And even the EU negotiators described Theresa May as, I forget the exact phrasing, but basically insane or incoherent or something like that, because Theresa May and the rest of the people in politics, for the most part, are doing their best to stay in the EU no matter what the British people want. A lot of people have called this a subversion of democracy, and with good reason. one of the big things that they're pushing for now is a second referendum. They want the British people to vote again on whether or not they should leave the European Union, but this has already been voted on. Voting on whether or not to rejoin the European Union once they've successfully left and given the British people what they voted for, that could potentially be democratic. But this would be like in America if, a lot of people would like it if we voted for the president again until we quote-unquote got it right in their minds. But, if... what's a good example that won't piss off too many people? If a new education bill came through where the government was demanding twice as much taxes to go towards education, so everyone's taxes would be increased by like 20%, but it would go towards education, but the government didn't have any explanation or description of how this money would be spent beyond it's going to education. I think there are a lot of people who would want more details than that and who would probably vote no to a 15% tax increase to go to quote-unquote education. But what if we voted down this insane tax increase and the government just said, well, no, we need this money, you're going to vote on it again. We don't think you voted right. Vote again. While pressuring people to change their opinion. It's undemocratic. There's just not another description of it. It's truly kind of terrifying. Now, this brings me to a couple of things that are going on in Britain. There's a recent story about a man covering his face. So Britain has a new facial recognition program that they're going to use to try and cut down on crime, which sounds useful but somewhat Orwellian. Well, a man tried to cover his face during one of the tests of this system because he probably didn't want to be on camera. I mean, there are some people who believe that cameras steal a part of your soul, so it can be a very personal thing. And he was fined and cited for misdemeanor and forced to reveal his face to the camera by the police, though he had done absolutely nothing wrong and didn't, as far as I can tell, have any outstanding warrants or anything like that. So, the British people are, on the one hand, stepping away from the EU to try and regain their sovereignty because the EU is becoming too Orwellian, while they themselves are taking some of the biggest steps towards 1984, for those of you who've read or seen it, that any country in the world has ever seen, at least in the mainstream. What does this tell you about the other countries in the European Union? I mean, Britain, of course, speaks English and has a history with America, so we hear more about them than a lot of the other countries in Europe. Americans tend to know a lot more about the English-speaking nations than the non, because it's easier for us to read their news. And so if this is what's going on in Britain, and they're leaving the EU because things are becoming too extreme, what are things like in the countries that are staying in the EU? And how long are people going to accept these pushbacks on their nation's sovereignty before patriotism sets in? Now, what members of the European Union are hoping and pushing for, I think, is that there will become a kind of European patriotism that goes over the national patriotism, and that this will sustain them, and that we won't see a Brexit or any of the others. But it's a tenuous prospect at best. I think that with Britain leaving, and I do think that, well, it's going to be a fight, the people of Britain are going to insist that they leave, regardless of what their government says, and even if it comes to civil war, I believe we will see Britain leave the EU. It just might not be pretty. And when they do, I don't think they'll be the only ones. I think we'll see at least several other leave, and it may become a domino effect. Now, the EU is going to push